The bell above the door made a sound you could feel in your chest before you even heard it. A thin, brass clatter that meant you'd arrived somewhere that mattered. You stepped onto wooden floorboards that had been walked soft by decades of boots and saddle shoes, and the smell hit you immediately. Something between sawdust and licorice, between coffee and motor oil, between the past and whatever afternoon you happened to be living in. If you grew up anywhere near a small town in America during the 1960s, that smell is still in you somewhere, locked in a room of your memory you don't visit often. This is the key. The corner general store, or the country store, or the neighborhood five and dime, or whatever your town happened to call it, was not just a place to buy things. It was a place where time moved differently, where adults talked in low voices about things you weren't supposed to understand yet, where the owner knew your last name and your grandmother's last name, and where a dime could make you genuinely, completely happy. We're going to walk through those doors again today, and some of what we find on the shelves might surprise you. Before we get to that back counter, and there's something about that back counter worth remembering, let's talk about what it actually took to get there. In most of these towns, the general store occupied a position on the landscape that was almost geographic in importance. It sat at a crossroads, or at the edge of a small downtown, or sometimes alone on a rural highway with a hand-lettered sign and a screen door that never quite stayed shut. It was rarely beautiful by architectural standards. The paint was often a generation old. The porch, if there was one, had at least one board that complained when you stepped on it. There might be a rusted Dr. Pepper thermometer nailed to the exterior, or an old RC Cola sign gone pale from years of sun. None of that bothered anyone. In fact, the shabbiness was part of the trust. A place that looked too new didn't have any history in it. You might have walked there alone. That's something worth sitting with for a moment. 8, 9, 10 years old, maybe younger, and you walked or rode your bike to the store by yourself, carrying whatever coins your mother had pressed into your hand, or whatever you'd scraped together from between the couch cushions and the jar on the counter. The route was yours. You knew which yards had dogs. You knew where the sidewalk buckled up from a tree root. That walk was its own kind of freedom, and the store was its reward. Inside, everything was arranged in a logic that only made sense if you'd grown up with it. The canned goods didn't always face the same direction. The hardware section, a cluster of bins filled with nails, bolts, washers, and screws, was often tucked beside the cooking supplies, because of course it was. There was no category manager at headquarters deciding where things should go. The owner put things where he, and it was usually a he, though sometimes a she, and sometimes a family so intermingled you couldn't tell one from the other, where they fit, and that was that. Over the years, the store grew its own internal geography, and regulars navigated it the way you navigate your own kitchen in the dark. The counter was the center of everything. Long, usually, and made of wood or glass, sometimes both, with a display case beneath the register holding the most valuable small things: cigarettes, maybe a pocket knife or two, the better candy, the aspirin. The register itself was a machine worth staring at. The heavy black keys, the crank handle on the side, the bell that fired when the drawer came open. Change was counted back to you out loud, placed in your palm, coin by coin, and if the owner did it right, and many of them did it exactly right, they'd say the total first, then count up from there. 63 cents, 65, 70, 75, $1. The math was performed in the open, like a small demonstration of trust. There's something about that back counter we need to return to. But first, the candy. This is where the whole experience narrows to a point for most people who were children in this era: the candy display. Glass jars or open bins or a cardboard rack near the register, and in it, penny candy in every possible form that sugar could be convinced to take. Wax bottles filled with a few drops of colored syrup, root beer barrels, Mary Janes with the peanut butter center that pulled at your back teeth, sugar babies if your town was big enough to stock them, fireballs wrapped in cellophane, buttons on paper strips, candy cigarettes in a little white box with a red tip on the end, which in retrospect says something fascinating about 1960s childhood that we'll just leave there. You could spend a very long time at that candy display with a dime, an almost meditative amount of time. The store owner might say something like, "You picking out the whole store?" But they didn't really rush you. They'd seen it 1,000 times. There was a ritual to it, checking what you could afford, recalculating, swapping one choice for another. And adults seemed to understand that this was serious business. Maybe in your house, the store run wasn't a childhood pleasure, but a practical errand. Your mother sending you with a list written in her handwriting on the back of an envelope. Bread, milk, a pound of bologna, and butter. The kind of errand that turned a Saturday morning into a small responsibility, and you knew you'd better not come back with the wrong thing or spend the change on anything else. The store owner knew. He always knew. If he knew your family, he knew what kind of bread your mother bought, and if you tried to get the cheaper loaf to save a nickel, he might just raise an eyebrow and say nothing. Or he might say it directly. Depends on the store. Depends on the man. But that accountability, the sense that your behavior inside that store reflected on your family, was something children absorbed without being taught it explicitly. You just felt it, the way you feel temperature. You stood up a little straighter inside that store than you did outside it. Some stores kept a tab, credit extended in handwritten form in a small notebook kept behind the counter or in the register drawer. Families with accounts, and many families had them, would come in, get what they needed, and the owner would write it down. At the end of the week or the end of the month, someone came in and settled it. This was a system built entirely on relationship and relationship. If you paid, you kept the account. If you didn't, you'd hear about it in ways that didn't require a letter from a collections agency. The community itself was the accountability system, quiet but effective. Now, that back counter. In the general stores that doubled as the town's informal gathering place, the back counter, or the side area near the window, was where the real currency of small-town life was exchanged. Information. Not gossip exactly, or not always, more like the constant updating of a shared social map. Who was sick? Whose crop had a problem this year? Who'd had a baby? Who'd lost someone? Who'd come back from somewhere? Who was moving away? Men in particular, farmers, tradesmen, the delivery driver who stopped in twice a week, they'd lean against that counter or pull up one of the stools and talk for a while. Not rushed. Nowhere to be, or at least nowhere that couldn't wait 20 minutes. Picture it, a Tuesday morning in June 1963. The store has been open since 6:30. The screen door has already swung open and shut a dozen times. A ceiling fan turns overhead, just fast enough to move the air without doing much about the heat. 3 men sit or stand near the back. One of them has a Coca-Cola. That's what they called it in parts of the South. One word, no capital. Coca-Cola. Pulled from the chest cooler by the door. Cold glass sweating in his hand. They're talking about whether the county road is going to be repaved this year, whether it's actually going to happen this time, because they said the same thing last year. No one raises their voice. The conversation moved the way water moves over flat ground, slow and easy and finding its own way. Children absorbed these scenes. You might have been standing at the candy rack 12 feet away, listening with one ear. Not understanding everything, understanding the tone. Learning how men talked about serious things without performing urgency. that the world's problems could be discussed with a cold bottle in hand and a little patience. Nobody was in crisis. They were just talking. The smells in that store were not one smell, but a layered thing that took a second to sort out. Coffee, almost certainly, percolated on a hot plate somewhere, or brewed in a big industrial pot if the store was busy enough. The particular dusty sweetness of bulk grains or dried beans in burlap or open bins. Motor oil from the shelf near the door that held transmission fluid and chain oil and other things that men needed without planning for. The waxy, sweet smell of the candy. Tobacco, cigarettes behind the counter, sometimes pipe tobacco in a glass canister, and the residual smoke of whoever had been there before you. Leather, if there were work gloves hanging from a pegboard. A trace of something agricultural when the farmers came in. And wood. Always wood. The floor, the shelves, the counter. A building that had been breathing and settling and aging for decades, with a smell that no new construction could manufacture. Summers had their own specific store logic. A hot afternoon walk meant the chest cooler was the first destination, not the last. Those chest coolers, the kind you had to lift the heavy lid and reach down into near-freezing water and melt ice to fish out what you wanted, were genuinely thrilling to a child on a July afternoon. You might paw around in there for a full minute, half your arms submerged, before deciding between an orange crush and a grape knee-high. The store owner never said anything about the time you spent in there. He understood the stakes. The bottles themselves were returnable, and that detail mattered more than it might seem today. You didn't just buy a drink, you held it in trust. When you were done, you brought the bottle back and you got your deposit. 2 cents usually, sometimes a nickel for the bigger bottles. This meant you were never quite finished with the transaction. The bottle kept a small thread between you and the store until you returned it. Some kids saved their bottles up in a brown paper bag and brought them in as a separate expedition, purely to convert them back into candy money. A complete economic cycle, small enough to hold in one hand. Autumn and winter brought different textures to the store. The light changed. The screen door got replaced with a storm door or a heavier one. People came in with coats and a different kind of hurry. Not summer's loose wandering, but the tighter, more purposeful movements of colder weather. The store stocked different things. Canning supplies ran out through late summer and early fall, when families were putting up vegetables, making jams and jellies, preserving the garden before first frost. The store might have a small hardware section that expanded quietly in the fall, because that was the season of fixing things: storm windows, fencing, the furnace, the truck that had been limping since August. And in December, the store became something else altogether. Not elaborate, never elaborate. But there would be a few things on the shelves that weren't there the rest of the year. Ribbon candy in a glass dish near the register. Maybe a small cardboard display of wrapping paper rolls. Holiday cards in a rack. None of it was the spectacle that retail would later become. It was understated in a way that made it feel more precious somehow. A small acknowledgement that the season was different without making a production of it. The owner might put a wreath on the door. That was often enough. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The store was one of the few places in a child's life where you were trusted to make real decisions with real consequences. You had money, your money or money entrusted to you, and you decided how to use it. If you bought a whole pack of Necco wafers and ate them all on the walk home and then felt slightly ill and had nothing left for the afternoon, that was a lesson that nobody needed to explain. The next time you stood at that candy rack, you remembered. Consequences were honest and immediate and proportional, and they belonged entirely to you. There were unspoken rules that every child figured out without a posted sign. You didn't touch things you weren't buying. You said please and thank you. and you didn't shout inside. If an adult came to the counter while you're in the middle of your transaction, you stepped back. Not all the way, just enough to signal that you understood the social order. If the owner said hello to you by name, you responded in kind. You didn't linger on the porch blocking traffic. These weren't rules written by anyone. They were learned by observation and corrected when necessary by the smallest possible social cue. A look, a silence, a tone of voice that told you exactly where the line was. The owners of these stores occupy a particular place in the memory of people who grew up in this era. Not beloved in a sentimental way, necessarily. Some were warm and generous, some were brisk and businesslike, some were somewhere in between and depended heavily on what kind of morning they were having. But almost all of them were known. Not just recognized, known. They knew your family, your circumstances, the general shape of your life. They'd been there for years, sometimes their whole lives, sometimes having taken over from a parent who'd run the place before them. There was a woman who ran a store outside a small town in rural Georgia for 31 years. She knew every regular customer's preferred brand of cigarettes, kept track of who was on a diet without being asked, and extended credit quietly to 3 families during a bad season without mentioning it to anyone. When she retired, the store closed. No one opened another one in that spot. The building became a storage space, then sat empty. What it had been couldn't be replicated by the building alone. That's the honest thread running through all of this. The store was never just the merchandise. It was the specific accumulation of time and relationship that a particular place held. The years of small transactions, the morning conversations, the tabs kept and settled, the children who grew up returning as adults with their own children, the continuity that a single, reliable place can offer a community when everything else keeps shifting. Think about what you actually bought there, if you can. Not just candy. Maybe a bottle of aspirin when your mother had a headache. Maybe a spool of thread in a specific color. Maybe a can of soup on the days when the grocery trip hadn't happened yet. These weren't dramatic purchases. They weren't meant to be. But the accumulation of them, years and years of small necessities handled in a familiar place by a familiar face, built something that felt, from the inside, like stability. Like the store would simply always be there, the way the church would always be there, the way the school would always be there. Part of the grammar of the town. By the late 1960s, some of these stores were already under pressure. The supermarket chains were expanding outward from city centers, following the highway systems, planting themselves in the new commercial strips going up outside of town. They had more of everything, more brands, more square footage, more parking. They were brightly lit and climate-controlled and fully stocked in a way the corner store couldn't match on its margins. Some general stores adapted. Some added a gas pump out front and became something closer to what we'd now call a convenience store. Some were sold and turned into other things. Some just closed, and the person who ran them retired, and nobody quite said out loud what had been lost because the loss was hard to quantify. You can't put a price on the feeling of being known. What stayed, for those who remember these places, is a particular quality of attention. The attention the store gave to a small community, and the attention the community gave back. The accountability of being recognized. The patience required. The patience of standing at a candy rack working out a purchase. The patience of waiting while the owner finished a conversation. The patience of having your change counted back to you 1 coin at a time. None of that felt like inconvenience when it was happening. It felt like how things worked. It felt like time spent among people who would remember your face next time. There's a specific image worth holding. The screen door in summer. The way it let the outside sounds in while you were browsing. A car going by. A dog barking somewhere down the road. The sound of a lawnmower 2 houses away. You are inside, but still connected to the outside. The store was not sealed off from the world. It breathed with the neighborhood around it. If you grew up in this era, you already have a store in your mind. You may not have thought about it in years, but it's there. The particular way the light came through the windows at a certain hour, the specific pitch of that bell above the door, the cool glass of a bottle against your palm on a hot afternoon. That's the kind of memory that doesn't age the way other memories do. It stays sensory, stays present. We'd love to hear yours. What was the name of the store near where you grew up? And what's the one thing you always bought there? Or the one thing you weren't allowed to buy, but tried to anyway? And here's a second question, because some of you will have two completely different answers. Did your store have a back counter where people gathered? And what did it smell like when you walked in? Leave those in the comments. There are people watching this right now who grew up in the same kind of place you did, maybe 1,000 miles away, and they want to hear it. If this kind of careful, unhurried look at the places and moments that shaped everyday American life is something you want more of, subscribing means you'll be here when the next one comes. Somewhere, in a town you still know the shape of, a brass bell is still making that sound.